So I wanted to discuss this article I had recently. It's in Middle East Eye, titled "The Secret History of Political Islam." And what I wanted to get at here was the idea that this modern movement that we're calling Islamism or political Islam, we know about the fact that you had the movement in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, had intellectuals and similar movements in Pakistan and in India, but the ultimate element is really not covered very much at all. We know why, because the Ottoman Empire ended in that period, 1922, 1923, 1924, and it was succeeded by a republic that was quite radical in its secular nationalism. So they didn't want to know about the the ulama and the devout intellectuals who had a different vision for how the Ottoman state should evolve in from after 1908, from the Young Turk Revolution up until the early 1920s. So, in a sense, you have a whole movement that's kind of written out of history. It's almost written out of Turkish history, to be quite honest, as well. If Republican historians had had their way, we might not even know about them. Republican history really kind of erased them, to be quite honest. And even if we're looking at the history of Islamic movements in the 20th century, partly because in Turkey there hasn't been any focus on them, that kind of led others to assume there was nothing there, nothing much to talk about. But it's not true. Uh, there was a movement, and it was reacting to the quite sharp, surprising adoption of secular nationalist ideologies amongst certain sections of the Ottoman elite in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The degree to which atheistic ideas were taken on board was surprising. And it was surprising, obviously, for many of the religious establishment and many of the intellectuals who, they accepted there was a need for the empire to reform, but they hadn't got their head around this idea that the fundamental problem, the fundamental explanation about why the Ottoman state had not been able to keep pace with the advances in Europe on various levels, military, technological, uh, economic, political, being able to extend power in that colonial manner that many of the European countries were able to do. That the main reason for this was somehow Islam, however that was defined. But this idea started to come from the Europeans that it was because of your religion. And this was accepted by a certain element of the Ottoman elite, specifically during that period when they were in exile and opposition under Abdulhamid. So the ideas specifically that they took on board were the kind of the positivism, as it's termed, of Auguste Comte in France, and as this movement, similar movement in Germany of referred to as vulgar materialism, which Shukru Haniolu has discussed in a number of books. And these ideas began to really take hold, and the response was quite sharp from a certain group of intellectuals from 1908, began to push back. They argued that they were facing. They accused them of being atheists. They were used this term "dinsiz" referring to them, which they objected to, especially someone like Ziya Gökalp, who became this major figure of Turkish nationalism in the future, came to be seen as somehow emblematic of the movement, as if he had atheistic positions himself. And he didn't really. He simply thought that, in a kind of Enlightenment manner, he thought that religion needed to be pushed back completely. Its institutions had no place in with the same power they had before over in the public sphere, over education, the courts. So that Enlightenment idea about religion being something personal, being individual, and not having a role in public space and being essentially divorced from the state was something that was really taken on board. And Ziago Calp really took on board that idea. And he came up actually with the term that we use today, Islamist. He coined the phrase Islamcı to refer to his opponents in this kind of grand debate that unfolded from 1908. And his motive there, in a sense, was to respond to the charge that secular nationalists were irreligious, they were dinsiz, they were atheistic. He's saying, no, we are. It's not that we lost our faith. It's just that we have a different conception of its role, religion's role within the modern state. So we can be Muslim, you can be Muslims, but we'll call you Islamists because you're kind of ideologizing the religion in a sense. Like this was the argument he made. Now the term makes it into Arabic decades later when people start talking about Islamiyin, Haraka Islamiyah, and then in English as Islamist later on, late in the 20th century and in more recent times as well. Obviously this word is all over the place now, but it came into being in this period before the Turkish Republic, which, as I say, not much light has been shed on. It's kind of been erased from the story, really. Um, one of the devout intellectuals who really pushed back was this figure who was actually the prime minister. Essentially, his position was what we would call prime minister of the Ottoman state during the First World War, where he was really kind of cooped in by the CUP and didn't. He was kind of a figurehead essentially, but he wrote a number of interesting works, including one which he called Islam Lashmak, with this, which would mean, sense he means is to become Islamic. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is we would say, well, the state was Islamic, the individual was Islamic. What is the idea that you have to become Islamic? And the idea there is something that is really the genesis of the Islamist movements throughout the rest of the 20th century, which is that modernity and its secular nationalism has done something to the state that has rendered our Muslimness in question in some way or another. So we have to kind of do something to the state itself to kind of return its Muslimness or its Islamicness, which in turn will affect the status of the individual as a Muslim as well. And he kind of lays out this idea there for the first time. And he uh, also talks there. Another idea that's become quite typical throughout the 20th century is this idea with this kind of rendering of the religion in ideological terms, modern ideological terms, as these movements began to do. Again, in this text, in this Islam Lashmak, you get for the first time the idea that this ideology that wants to Islamize is dealing with every aspect of modern life. You know, it's not whether it could be anything. It can be the architecture, it can be the history, it can be the food. Every little aspect of how life is lived and how one presents oneself ends up being uh, liable to the concept that it needs to be Islamicized. And you get that in that book as well for the first time. Now, these ideas, like I say, they become developed in a big way, and especially in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood under Hassan al-Banna and its major ideological figure, Said Qutb, in the 1950s and 60s when he was writing a whole lot of books that he wrote. And as well, Maududi in Pakistan and Muhammad Iqbal in India. These ideas are kind of kicking around there as well. There is some, Muhammad Iqbal was aware of Said Halim Pasha himself and others in uh, pre-Republican, the pre-Republican Ottoman state and what was happening within that Islamic movement. He makes reference to it. He's aware of it, but you don't see much reference to it elsewhere. Um, when the Republic comes along, some of these figures, some of the most important amongst them, they flee abroad because they realize there's no room for them in the new order, and they're important figures and they have some really interesting things to say. Uh, Two that jump out are Mustafa Sabri, who was the kind of Sheikh al-Islam or the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman state in its final years. He wasn't the very last one, but he was a Grand Mufti on 4 or 5 separate occasions between 1919, 1920. On a whole of the separate occasions, he was the figure of the. He kind of resigned. He had arguments with the prime minister, and then left, and then was brought back. That kind of thing. But he was a very important figure, and also his deputy in that position, which was Zahid Kafsari, or as he became known later in Arabic, Zahid al-Kawthari. So these two figures fled in 1922 when Mustafa Kemal's forces took over Istanbul after defeating the Greek after the Greek invasion. They stormed into Istanbul, which was still occupied by Britain, but Britain at that point had given up objecting to what Mustafa Kemal had been doing from Ankara, and the forces of Ankara, which had their parliament, took over Istanbul, and these figures fled. They ended up in Egypt, kind of by circuitous routes. They ended up in Egypt for a bit, and then abroad, then back in Egypt, and they stayed in Egypt for a long time, and they were both there until the early 1950s when both of them died. Um, and in Sabri's writings in particular, he takes on what he saw had happened to in Turkey with this new secular order that he regarded as radical, and and his ideas overlap in many ways with what you then get from Said Qutb in Egypt as well. They didn't know each other. Their ideas of this idea, as I said, that came earlier in Selim Pasha's work of how the state had lost its Islamic nature, and because of what had happened to the judiciary, the Sharia courts, to ulama supervision of education, the complete pushing back of the role of the ulama in late Ottoman Turkey and then in the Turkish Republic, when it became even more radical and they were completely shoved out of the scene. Except in small ways, the state obviously still needed to use them because a whole part of the population still considered themselves absolutely devout, believing Muslims, even though the regime didn't like that. But that was still the case. So there was still a need for the religious establishment. But this ideological push against this whole new dispensation, which began in the late Ottoman Empire, was pushed further by Mustafa Sabri in his writings in Egypt, and then further still by Said Qutb in his more famous works in the 1950s and 1960s. Mustafa Sabri's work, what's interesting is he did write them in Arabic, which makes them a lot more accessible. But as a essentially in the new consideration, he's simply a Turk, which means in nationalist era, which means in Turkey, there's not really too much interest in him because he's kind of done everything you're not meant to do. He's fled the country. He's opposed to the new regime. He's opposed to Mustafa Kemal personally. He's lauding the previous transnational order in which, for him, Arabic is more important as a language than Turkish. And so there's no interest in him in Republican Turkey. So you won't hear him very much talked about until the more recent era where things have changed. And especially under the AKP, obviously they're kind of promoting anything that has a kind of Islamist tinge to it. And now it's possible to even talk about people like Mustafa Sabri. Well, you couldn't really before. His opposition to Ataturk himself was extremely controversial. Um, and so as well, Sabri, he's kind of ignored in Turkey, but also in Egypt. Even if he's writing in Arabic, he's Turkish, and even in even there too, he kind of falls through the cracks in a sense. So from both perspectives, and history does tend to be written these days from a nationalist view, whether we mean it or not. It tends to be something that takes over the way I think most historians approach what they do. So it's been kind of easy to miss the importance of what these people were saying, whether it was in late Ottoman Istanbul or whether it was in Cairo, where many uh, figures from that period fled. It's been easy to ignore what they said, and therefore to miss that kind of essential part of the whole story about how these modern Islamic movements came to be. We're missing part of it because there was this bit needs to be fit into the story and it's not there. Um, okay, I wrote about this. I'll just show it. It was in Middle East Eye. Uh, here from Middle East Eye. Was there recently. Secret History of Political Islam. Uh, and I'll put the link below. But yeah, I think the full story about how these movements came to be has not been told, and this is in particular is one element that really needs to uh, be focused again because it's really been completely forgotten. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and hit the bell for notifications of future videos.